Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about the most versatile races in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, starting with the Wood Elves. The Wood Elves actually have a great deal more versatility than you might think. That's because, from a practical standpoint, there are basically only two playstyles you want to use in the campaign: the range playstyle, and of course the Treekin playstyle, which involves the Forest Spirits. But there's a lot more options for the Wood Elves than just Treekin and Glade Guard into Way Watchers. From any tier 1 settlement you can of course recruit Glade Guard, but you do have some fairly solid infantry options, and you'll want the structure anyway to be able to get Glade Captains as a hero, and you can get Blade Singers, which are absolutely ridiculous in battle because of their very high bonus versus infantry and armor piercing damage, though certainly low armor, but they do have a great deal of power when it comes down to it, and as do some of the other units. War Dancers, not necessarily so good. Eternal Guard, pretty decent. Spirit Infantry unit, and Wildwood Rangers also being quite capable as well. In terms of their ranged options, they do have Glade Guard, but they have Glade Guard with different roles. It would be great to be able to swap these guys out on the fly, either during battle or on the campaign map, to deal with different situations, but you do have two different versions, or rather three different versions of the Glade Guard: the baseline one and then two specialized ones. Then you have Deepwood Scouts, just really good units as well, firing while moving, being quite useful, Vanguard deployment, and stock there. And then finally at tier 4, you get Way Watchers, which are one of the best range units in the game. Very high level of damage, firing while moving, having stock, having Woodsman, and of course also armor piercing missile damage. So a good amount of power when it comes to Way Watchers, master ambushers in the game. Cavalry choices wise, you do start with Glade Riders, which are decent enough, but they're basically more like hit and run units, not necessarily capable of standing up in a fight. You do get Wild Riders at tier 3, just basically a better version of that, though they do have Vanguard deployment and frenzy, as well as physical resistance and fear. Then Sisters of Thorn, which are magical cavalry, like they get some magical abilities, Vanguard deployment, decent enough melee and range ability on them as well, like skirmisher cavalry units basically with magical attacks. And then finally the Great Stag Knights, which are actually quite strong. High level of charge bonus, frenzy, good level of armor, good physical resistance. These guys can be a bit strong as a shock cavalry unit when it comes to Warhammer 3. Then the stars of the show, of course, Dryads, Treekin, and Treemen with the Zoats as well. All of these really good units, and absolutely terrifying to face in a campaign, like the Treekin especially, with their high level of armor and leadership being quite very effective. Then flying unit wise, you get Grey Eagles, Hawk Riders, and Forest Dragons. So you get the pretty decent dragon choice. Flying skirmisher cavalry units, which is pretty damn crazy. These guys are actually pretty decent in range. All Wood Elven units that have ranged are pretty decent in range, of course, for obvious reasons. Absolutely absurd if you're playing the Sisters of Twilight. Grey Eagles, not really worth it all that much. Eagles in general in Warhammer 3 aren't worth it at all. Now, lore choices, you do have Spellcaster lore choice, which does have various schools of magic, including some really good ones: High Magic, Dark Magic, Shadows, and Life winning. Beasts is not really as good as the other choices, but still plenty of choices when it comes to magic. Then Ancient Treemen, which are really the lords you're probably going to want to recruit faction-wide unless you're trying to fill some office or another, because they give Treekin 20% ward save with a special skill. Pretty dangerous in battle as well in melee. Also have, of course, access to magic as well. So really a really good lore choice. Then two hybrid choices with, or basically one hybrid choice with the Glade Lord, the different types of Glade Lord when it comes down to it. The hybrid lore choices aren't really great. They certainly fall behind compared to the Caster Lords and the Ancient Treemen, but they're still available for you if you want that kind of lord in your campaign, but not really worth using compared to Spellweavers and Ancient Treemen. Caster wise, like, you do have a hero caster in the Spellsingers, just giving you access to magics. Then you get Glade Captains and Waystalkers, which are two different type of hybrid weapon specialists in your campaign. Pretty decent, though not really all that great necessarily. And then, of course, the branch rapes, which give you replenishment, give you a decent melee ability, and also have access to replenishment, which is always useful to have in a campaign. So overall, some fairly solid choices over here for heroes. Not necessarily so great when it comes to lords, but still, the Wood Elves do have a good amount of flexibility in their roster. They lack artillery, but with Treekin in your armies, you don't need them. Or with flying Hawk Riders just bypassing the walls and killing everything inside behind those walls, you don't really need them. And you can also break down the walls if you're playing Durfu and use his faction effect that gives them Wall Breaker. Really good amount of power, really fits what the how the Wood Elves play on the campaign map. Really powerful, scary powerful. Like, invading Alpha Lorem in the campaign is not a fun experience. Let's just put it like that. And number 4, we have the Greenskins. With their melee roster at tier 1, well, it's practically worthless with goblins and orc boys. They're decent enough melee units, but there's much better playstyles to go for with the Greenskins when it comes to a tier 1 army. At tier 2, however, in their melee tree, they get one of the best campaign infantry units in the entire game, the Nasty Skulkers. These guys are ridiculous. They're ridiculous because of various skills that the Greenskins have on their lords, research, gaining a significant amount of power, and the majority of their damage being armor piercing. These guys can destroy units that are much higher tier throughout the course of your campaign. To give you an idea, in this campaign, in this Grom campaign, this army defeated Be'lakor. Without really too much hassle, though Be'lakor is always scary to fight in a battle. At tier 3, you get Orc Biggins, the Night Goblins, and the Night Goblins. Now, these guys are kind of worthless to actually use in a campaign. They're decent. They're more powerful than... Well, the Biggins are far better than the Orc Boys, but in a world with the Nasty Skulkers, there's almost no reason to bother with these guys unless you want a decent enough frontline melee unit to soak the damage, but there are better options for the Greenskins at tier 3. And Night Goblins, just not really that great of a unit. Decent stats, sure, but don't hold the candle to the Nasty Skulkers. At tier 4, you do get the Fanatic version of the Night Goblins. Have a decent ability in combat with this particular skill, the Spinning Loons. But it's really the Black Orcs that take the cake. Heavily armored, high leadership, good stats all around the board. If there's any melee infantry unit you want to use throughout the course of your campaign beyond Nasty Skulkers, it's these guys. Unless you're playing Warzag, I'll get into Savage Orcs in just a moment later on. Then you get cavalry choices. Now, cavalry is split between two structures, basically. You've got the Goblin cavalry units, so from Wolf Riders, Wolf Rider Archers, Chariots, Spider Archers, and Spider Riders. Pretty decent units, but not really worth using. Though at tier 4 with the structure, you can get the Ragnaros Spider, which is certainly a really good unit throughout the campaign, but isn't necessarily worth getting the structure for. Dedicated cavalry-wise, or Orc cavalry-wise, you get the Boar Boys. Pretty worthless, actually, though certainly a decent enough cavalry choice, but just not worth getting in the Greenskin army. Though the Orc Boar Biggins are a completely different story at tier 4. Much better stats, higher leadership, higher armor. They just handle themselves so much better in a battle. And the Orc Boar Chariots, pretty solid chariot choice. You also, of course, have the Squig Herds and the Night Goblin Squig Hoppers. Generally not worth bothering with these guys, though. They can handle themselves in battle decently, but there's, again, better options with the Greenskins. Monstrous unit-wise, you get the Trolls, which are actually a unit that a lot of people underestimate. These guys are siege breakers. They're pretty effective when it comes to it. Their leadership is low, but their other stats are fairly decent. A bit low on the armor side, but they do have regeneration. They will handle themselves quite effectively in battle, though they are vulnerable to fire. At tier 3, however, you get the best Trolls. You get the Stone Trolls and the River Trolls. River Trolls are decent, they debuff the enemy, but it's the Stone Trolls that win the prize. These guys are ridiculous. Higher level of armor, missile resistance, spell resistance, causes fear. Just a much better unit to have in the campaign. And then Giants at tier 4, which are not really worth bothering with. So with this structure, you basically should build this in a minor settlement throughout your empire, because you're not really going to benefit that much from the Giants, though certainly some of the benefits you can get from the structure at tier 4 might be worth it to get it in provincial capital. Then you have siege engines, if you want to call it that. Basically a bunch of chariots, snarling pump wagons of various kinds. You get rock lobbers at tier 3. Pretty solid unit when it comes to siege ability in sieges. Not so great on the battlefield, but pretty solid when it comes to knocking down walls, dealing with wall towers. And then at tier 4 you get the Doom Diver catapults, which are better in an open field battle and still pretty effective against walls. Then you also have the Rogue Idol as the ultimate monster unit in probably the entire game. Ridiculous level of power, ridiculous level of armor, unbreakable, just very, very difficult to deal with. Just really powerful unit in general. Very hard to take down, though very slow, though that's not necessarily a disadvantage in the campaign, especially given the majority of the battles you deal with throughout the course of the campaign. Then, of course, there are the Savage Orcs. Savage Orcs are pretty strong in a battle because of their stats, but their low armor makes them vulnerable, so they'll take a lot more damage. That's the tier 1 version, basically. Then you have Savage Orc Big Guns, which are a completely different story. Still 0 armor, but certainly much more effective when it comes to their battle prowess than the regular ones at the end of the day. These guys, the way you should view these guys, they're more like charging melee infantry because of all the charge benefits they get. They won't necessarily do very well in a stand-up fight unless you're playing Warzag, but still fairly effective when it comes down to it. And then you have the Savage Orc Boar Boys, which are actually far better in quite a few ways than the regular Orc Boar Boys, though lower armor as usual with the Savage Orcs, though still a huge amount of physical resistance and frenzy, of course. And then the Savage Orc Boar Boys Big Guns. These guys are certainly pretty solid in their own right as well. Frenzy, physical resistance, just better stats around the board. Generally speaking, though, with Savage Orcs, you should not bother with them in their campaign unless you're playing Warzag and you've got access to his skill line. So when we're looking at Warzag, he gets a bunch of benefits to Savage Orcs, physical resistance, when it comes to that charge bonus, melee attack. So Savage Orcs are only really worth using within that context of with Warzag. Also because his Lord effect affects them as well. If we look back at it, he gets an upkeep benefit to them, physical resistance to them, which is actually something that's going to help increase their durability by quite a lot. Now, lore choices, the Greenskins are unfortunately fairly lacking. You do get the Goblin Grey Shamans, Night Goblin War Bosses, and Orc War Bosses. Now, of these three, basically only the Goblin Grey Shamans are worth it. The Orc War Bosses are better if you just want a dedicated melee lord, but the thing is, they are lacking one critical skill that only the Goblin Grey Shamans have, and that's the skill of Goblin Tide. Certainly the Greenskin meta right now is to use a lot of Goblins, so having 15 armor for Goblin units makes the Nasty Skulkers far more ridiculous, and all the Goblin units quite a bit more ridiculous as well in general. So a great deal of power, although I'm pretty sure it doesn't affect Night Goblins, but still. It affects Nasty Skulkers. That's really the part that actually matters there. Now, hero selection choices wise, you get the Black Orc Big Bosses as a solid melee choice, pretty good in battle with their skill line. The Goblin Big Boss is basically the Goblin melee hero. Not really so great, can be hard to unlock, pretty mediocre in a lot of ways. Like the sneaky melee heroes are generally not the better ones. The Giant River Troll Hags as a decent caster, though really useful because of the replenishment skill they have. And of course Shamans, specifically Orc Shamans, you should never bother with High Goblin Shamans. Orc Shamans giving you a fairly good caster option that really helps your army with the playstyle the Greenskins have. Like between melee attack, the powerful damage skills they have, these guys are very useful to have in a campaign. It's a shame because it would be fun to play around with some Night Goblin Shamans, but there's never a reason to recruit them when they're sharing the same structure that increases capacity and you have to choose between them. Like, what's the reason why you'd ever choose a Goblin Shaman versus an Orc Shaman? I would never understand it, to be honest. But yeah, the Greenskins have a lot of possibilities when it comes to their rosters, though generally speaking, at tier 1, you only want to recruit Goblin Archers, unless you're playing Warzag, in which case you recruit Savage Orcs. Then at tier 2, you fill your armies with nasty skulkers, still get goblin archers, and you may get the tier 2 trolls. At tier 3, night goblin archers, stone trolls, really effective units, maybe some rock lobbers if you want the siege ability, though it kind of becomes redundant because because by the time the rock lobbers take down the walls, your stone trolls may have won the battle already. At tier 4, black orcs are really the only unit that's actually really worth considering. Cavalry is good. The problem is you don't need it as the Greenskins. The majority of battles are siege battles anyway in the campaign, and even on open field battles, there are other options when it comes down to it. Like trolls can be really fast. That's the thing. Sure, not as fast as cavalry, but still pretty damn fast. So these guys can act as your dangerous flankers in a battle. That's the great thing about trolls. And at tier 5, of course, rogue idols. Maybe just 1 or 2 in an army if you just want a unit to throw against the entire enemy army and watch it survive. Get them to tar pit it and then cast magic, cast a Foot of Gork there, and watch every enemy unit die. Great deal of versatility on the roster, even if you're not really using much of it throughout the course of your campaign. Like an army like this, or an army like this one, is what you're probably going to be using throughout the majority of your campaign, if not all of your campaign. There's obviously some flexibility, of course, when it comes down to it, but that's the majority of the units that you'd be running around in your army. Focused on goblins and night goblin archers for the sake of the range prowess, trolls for those frontline fighters, nasty skulkers for the damage dealing capability in melee, and maybe some artillery to help soften up some targets before you deal with things. And number 3, we have the Warriors of Chaos, and to be honest, in a lot of ways they do deserve a higher spot on this list, but they are lacking in ranged options. They do have some, but they are incredibly limited. However, from a melee perspective, cavalry perspective, monsters perspective, as well as demonic units, they are incredibly good. They have a lot of different choices for different situations. Like you can get Chaos Warriors of Nurgle, which have a lot more durability, or Chaos Warriors of Slaanesh if you're dealing with a situation where you need that extra mobility on the battlefield. You can switch between weapons, like dealing with a lot of cavalry, get Chaos Warriors with halberds. Dealing with a lot of infantry, Chaos Warriors with great weapons, or just regular Chaos Warriors, because they're quite capable. Their roster is ridiculous, starting at Marauders, which are decent enough. Melee combatants, obviously on the weaker side at tier 1. It's always difficult to say what tier a unit is for the Warriors of Chaos, given how their recruitment system and upgrade system works. But basically, early on, you'll be getting a lot of Marauders. Decent enough units, especially some of the specialized version. Then moving on, basically at tier 2 with Chaos Warriors. Really good units, high levels of armor, pretty good melee stats in general, and of course the different kinds over there. Forsaken, also a pretty solid unit that is pretty decent in battle when it comes to that. Just doesn't have the same kind of customization options that you get with Chaos Warriors. And then moving on, of course, to Chosen, one of the best, if not the best, melee infantry in the entire game. Just absolutely ridiculous when we're looking at their stats. When it comes to their cavalry and chariots, well, their chariots are pretty solid, though you may not necessarily have a reason to use the chariots throughout the course of the campaign, because you have really good cavalry as well with the Chaos Knights, the various Chaos Knights, like the Chaos Knights of Slaanesh having devastating flanker makes them absolutely insane as a charging cavalry, like the Chaos Knights of Slaanesh with lances in particular, doing 120 charge damage with the devastating flanker is pretty insane when it comes to cavalry, or durable cavalry with either Nurgle or Tzeentch, or just the stand-up cavalry with Skull Crushers of Khorne, for instance. Lots of flexibility over here. Monster-wise, there is one unit that steals the show, which is, of course, the Chaos Trolls Armor. These guys are pretty good at battle, just like the Greenskin situation. Really good at siege breaking, though you won't have problems in your campaign even without these guys, but these guys you can get very quickly in a campaign. Chaos Warhounds, not really worth all that much. Then the various Chaos Shrines that give you different benefits depending on which god you've gotten it for. Or just a regular Chaos Shrine, right? The baseline one. But still, plenty of power over here. Giants, not really worth it all that much. Dragon Ogres, pretty solid unit, pretty decent. Siege Attacker unit. And then, of course, the big ones like Dragon Ogre Shaggoths. Then there's the demonic units. The ones that are worth using are the Bloodletters of Khorne for their really good armor-piercing damage, and the Exalted Bloodletters of Khorne. And then some mobile versions like the Screamers of Tzeentch, for instance, Fleshhounds, Skull Cannons. A huge roster in its own right. Now, hero selection-wise and lord selection-wise, it can feel fairly limited with just cast lords and cast sorcerer lords, and basically with heroes just like the hero versions of those. But there's a ridiculous level of customization with your lords and heroes beyond the boons of chaos, the various gods you can dedicate these guys to, and the various benefits you will gain by doing so. So a good amount of power and good amount of versatility when it comes to their lords and heroes, even if there's only 2 choices. Of course, this applies specifically for Undivided, though there's still a decent amount of customization even for the Monogod Champions of Chaos. Like, half their Legendary Lord roster is Undivided, even if Sigvald is a fanboy of Slaanesh, he's still Undivided, while the other half are just dedicated to one god or another. Good artillery as well, like the Hell Cannon. When it comes down to it, like the Hell Cannon might be a gift of chaos, but still the Hell Cannon is an absolutely powerful siege unit. Very good, very accurate, unbreakable. One of the best, if not the best, artillery units in the entire game. And number 2, we of course have the Skaven. The Skaven roster possibilities are quite ridiculous, though people will point out that different legendary lords, especially the DLC ones, seem to be dedicated to one playstyle or another. Certainly they have benefits with those playstyles, but there's nothing really limiting you from using the units from the other playstyles in your campaigns, unless we're talking, of course, about Deathmaster Snitch. But even he has access to the entire roster, it just might be more expensive to get access to those other units. So, when talking about Skaven, at Tier 1, they get Skaven Slaves, Skaven Slave Spears, and Slingers. These guys are practically worthless in a campaign. From a Tier 1 Barracks, in terms of their melee choices, their baseline melee choices, you get Clan Rats and Clan Rats with Spears. Not really great units, decent enough in a fight, I suppose, but just not really a good unit. At Tier 2, however, in terms of melee options, the Clan Rats get shields, so they are more durable against range power, but still remain effectively the same unit. Tier 3, however, you do get Storm Vermin, which are far better as a melee unit, though not necessarily the kind of melee unit you'd use a lot throughout the course of your campaign, maybe a couple of them as Tresh Craventail, basically. But those aren't just the only melee units. Moving on to, well, you could call them ranged units, Night Runners and Night Runners with Slings. Like, basically, Night Runners with Slings are melee infantry that has some range capability, but not necessarily the biggest amount, whereas the Night Runners with Slings are more of a dedicated ranged infantry. But both of them kind of fill the same role, just one's better in range, the other one is better as a dedicated melee unit. These guys are skirmish infantry. They can shoot while moving, Vanguard deployment, a lot of flexibility on the battlefield, and can actually take quite a bit of damage as well. At Tier 2, you do get Gutter Runners, which are effectively the improved version. What's the difference between Gutter Runners and Night Runners, you might ask? Well, there are several benefits when it comes down to it. One of the bigger ones is the net strength in numbers, of course, you also get that, but scurry away as well, resilience, physical resistance, just a bunch of like armor benefits, better stats throughout across the board. The net in particular can be particularly useful for them, but otherwise they're much the same unit, really, when it comes down to it. It's just really that net can affect enemies in range and just give you more mobility with them. At Tier 3, when we're talking about some other Eshin units, basically, you get the Eshin Triads, pretty decent melee unit, relatively low armor, but still fairly solid when it comes to battle potential. Death Runners, also fairly solid when it comes to battle potential, though not necessarily one of the best. And then it's just so ridiculous with Skaven that they have so many units across so many buildings that it can be ridiculous. You do get Warp Grinders as a fairly good siege unit, because they have siege attackers. They're quite capable when it comes to battles, they can break down walls, which is always a significant advantage in Warhammer 3. Then, of course, the flamethrowers with the warp fire throwers, and then moving on into railing gunners and artillery options, or weapon teams, basically. Like, railing gunners are machine gunners. The globadiers are mortar teams, short range mortar teams, but still mortars. And then you get bombardiers and poison wind mortars, really good units that do a ridiculous amount of damage. And then your snipers, your warplock Jezzails. I would say railing gunners are not really worth using at the moment in the game, just because of all the issues with gunpowder units, but Jezzails will get the job done. And certainly globadiers, bombardiers, and poisoned wind mortars will do a ridiculous amount of damage against the units they're dealing with. They have a good amount of durability as well, and the damage they do is ridiculous, even if their range is limited. Then you have Plague Claw Catapults as a tier 3 siege unit into Doomflayers and Warp Lightning Cannons. Warp Lightning Cannons are not really worth using. Doomflayers can be worth using for the flexibility on the battlefield. Doom Wheels, not necessarily quite as much. Then you have the Plague Monks and the Plague Priests. Again, decent enough infantry options. Like, they have so much melee infantry, and quite a lot of it is fairly decent. These guys will hold their ground in a battle. They have a really good amount of leadership, frenzy, and of course physical resistance. And then you move on to the Plague Monk Census Bearers, which are just basically the improved version. Then you've got the monsters, Wolf Rats, Rat Ogres, Mutant Rat Ogres, Brood Horrors, and Hell Pit Abominations. Like, just a really solid roster throughout. Like, you've got fast movers, you've got skirmisher infantry, you've got stand-up melee infantry, you've got artillery, you've got pretty much everything that you'd want in an army. Then we get into the lore choices. Now, I've done a whole video, and talking about all of this makes, just thinking about how many heroes the Skaven have makes my head hurt. But basically, they have Graciers, Assassins, Warlock Masters, and Warlords as lore choices. The Gracier is useful for a magic lord, though you'll get plenty of magic throughout the campaign as Skaven. That's not really a problem, but they're useful for diplomacy with other Skaven. Master Assassins are great for the skirmisher infantry. The reason behind that situation is that, if I can find a Master Assassin in this particular campaign, we do have one here. They're great for the skirmisher infantry, the Night Runners and Gut Runners, because they have this particular skill that gives them 10% missile strength and also concealment bomb. So, a great deal of power when it comes to that, and they also get an extra ambush chance, which is always useful as Skaven because you can always ambush an enemy. You have a chance of ambushing an enemy. So they're the better ones. Then you get Warlock Masters. Warlock Masters are basically another caster lord. They can get some skills that benefit your gunpowder line if you want to go for it, casualty replenishment, some spellcrafting, some construction costs, and just some nasty abilities on the battlefield. And then finally the Warlords. The benefit of the Warlords is that when it comes to their special skill line, they can give you benefits faction-wide with growth with this particular skill, making them useful. And they're also the best melee combatants of the lord options you have available. Hero-wise, that is a lot. There's a lot of heroes. It actually doesn't even it doesn't even fit in one page. So you get sorcerers, which are either plague priests or Eshin sorcerers, warlock engineers that buff up your range units, pack masters that buff up the monster units, assassins that are sneaky stabby kind of guys, and battle, and then chieftains. Then there's the chieftains. And what the chieftains do is that they're a fairly solid melee choice at the end of the day, if I have one. They're a fairly solid melee choice. They buff up the loyalty of your lord. They give that lord ward save. So you can make an entire chieftain stack just to throw it in an army and give your lord a ridiculous amount of ward save. As well as some other benefits, like they have mobility on the battlefield, they have a mount that's pretty solid, good amount of speed, good amount of stats overall. So overall, a great roster, has a lot of choices, a lot of options, and quite a few of these playstyles do work, from the baseline clan rats, because sure, they're not great, but you can mask them pretty effectively, to obviously my preferred playstyle, which is to go with Night Runners, into Gut Runners, into Death Runners, with some artillery and support. Or you can get a gun line for all the downsides that exist right now, or powerful artillery options and weapon team options that do exist, or powerful monster options for your equivalent of cavalry, basically, with speed on the battlefield and a lot of power on the battlefield. And also, since they're monsters and not cavalry, you can actually use them quite effectively in sieges, or most of them at any rate. Finally, and number 1, we get to the High Elves. The High Elves have so many options when it comes to the roster. Maybe not quite as many as the Skaven, though all of their units are fairly effective. At tier 1, you'll get either Spearmen or Archers. Then, of course, Archers with light armor and Rangers. Spearmen are good at holding the line. Archers are capable of doing a lot of damage because they have one of the highest ranges of range units in the entire game, though not necessarily the best armor piercing. And Rangers are pretty good, effective dual sword infantry unit that can hold their own against quite a few other units, though not as good as Nasty Skulkers, unfortunately. Then you get the solid choices of Lauder and Sea Guard, which are a hybrid unit between Archers and Spearmen, Silver and Guard for just a better Spearman version, Shadow Warriors for a better Archer that is a sneaky one because they get stock and they can shoot while moving, as well as Vanguard deployment. Basic cavalry-wise, you get Illyrian Reavers and Illyrian Reaver Archers, Skirmisher Cav, or Fast-Moving Cav in the case of the regular Illyrian Reavers that can dominate the battlefield when it comes to speed. But in a more stand-up fight, you do have the Silver Helms with their pretty heavy armor. Then you have a couple of monster units available over here, as well as another infantry choice in the White Lions of Crix. Not necessarily worth using, though the White Lions can certainly hold their own quite a few ways in battle. They do have pretty good armor when it comes down to it. Vulnerable to range, though. You do get Great Eagles, which are pretty worthless in War Lions of Crix, which, again, not really a great choice, but you do have some fast moving units in the air and on the ground. And then you can also get the Sisters of Avalorn, which are one of the best range units in the game. Magical attacks, flaming attacks, high amount of armor piercing, just a really good unit, though a bit expensive. Artillery-wise, the High Elves are unfortunately limited with only the Eagle Claw bolt throwers, though they do have several chariot options, with the best one, of course, being the Lion Chariots of Crix. Then there's more. You do have some really high-end infantry choices with the Sword Masters of Hoeth, with their benefit of bonus to infantry and armor piercing, good stats all around the board, capable of holding their own against pretty much anything, really, especially if their HP stays high. And then the Phoenix Guard, which are quite capable of holding the line due to their physical resistance, their high leadership, their high armor, just their relatively high durability throughout. Then flying units, Phoenixes, 2 different kinds, or actually 3 different kinds, with Arcane Phoenix winning the prize, and then various dragons. And also, finally, another cavalry choice, the best cavalry choice, with the Dragon Princes. A bit unfortunate with the Dragon Princes that they don't have good armor piercing, because otherwise they are a really, really solid unit. Very durable, pretty good in battle, just expensive and lacking armor piercing means they're less useful against some of the higher end units, and of course the dragons being powerful. Lord and hero choices. Well, you have 3 lord choices. Archmages, which have so many magical choices. This applies to your regular mages, your hero mages as well. Having so many different kinds of magic, and actually being pretty decent in a stand-up fight as well, because they can fly dragons. Princes, just your dedicated melee fighters with a bunch of army benefits, and princesses, which are your range lords, ineffective in battle, but still they can ride dragons and they can give you a bunch of benefits to your range units. Hero-wise, you have handmaidens, which give you significant diplomatic benefits and influence benefits across the board, and control benefits across your entire faction. Nobles that are pretty solid fighters and can also give you benefits, be it in trade in a local province or diplomatic benefits as well. Lore Masters of Hoeth, which are a hybrid magic melee lore. Like, they get magical skills that help buff them up or other units next to them in melee, and then of course your mage heroes at the end of the day. So overall, a really, really good roster, only lacking in artillery, but good hero choices, good unit choices, good lore choices throughout the board, with the exception of the ranged lore choice, which is, in my opinion, fairly weak, but that's an issue with all ranged lords and heroes in the game at the moment. Handmaidens, by the way, are more useful in melee than they are in range, though they do have a ranged option as well. When it comes to the High Elf situation, that's not all there is to it, of course, because there is actually more when we're looking at them. There's the Mistweaver units that Telfarion has access to. There's the Tree Spirit units that Alariel has access to. There's the Shadow Walker units that Alifanar has access to. So you have Legendary Lords that also have their own versatile rosters on top of the already versatile roster that the High Elves have access to. So a great deal of power, a great deal of options. You can make melee armies work with them. You can make cavalry work with them. You can make ranged work with them very, very well. Plenty of choices, plenty of flexibility in heroes, lords, and units for the campaign. That's why the High Elves win. Though your basic army of spearmen and archers remains actually one of the more powerful ones you can use in the game. Everything else can feel secondary to that, but you do have those choices if you're dealing with various foes throughout the campaign, but this kind of army here is incredibly effective. Everything else is, well, it's useful. Don't get me wrong. It's very, very useful, but it's more like an addition to this type of army than anything else.